Hello, welcome to the third part of the lecture on RCTs, or randomized controlled trials. In this part we look at some real examples of randomized controlled trials that have been carried out in different countries. First one is in Afghanistan, and it's on education. In this example, policymakers suspected that outcomes for children were seriously affected by whether or not they had a school that's local, as in actually in their village, and that in many cases having to travel to another school that's in a nearby village would put people off going to school and have consequences for their education because of the time and the cost and perhaps the danger of travelling, and of course particularly for girls, where culturally it might not be appropriate for them to travel to a different village. So to do this RCT, they started with 31 villages in northwest Afghanistan, and they randomly selected 13 villages which then received new schools. And those 13 villages where the new schools were built were called the treatment group, and the other 18 villages that did not get schools were called the control group. And then 1 year later, educational participation and outcomes were measured. Now, in this case, as I said in the previous video, that's a pure RCT, but they also measured the participation and outcomes beforehand, as you almost always do. So you might like to draw out the way you would look at that in terms of NRXO notation. So there's observation before and afterwards. So what did they find? Well, compared to the control group, in the 13 treatment school groups, compared to the 18 control group ones, overall enrolment went up by 42 percentage points more. Test scores were substantially higher, and in particular girls' enrolments and girls' scores went up by even more than they went up among the boys in the treatment group compared to the control group. So quite dramatic results, especially for the girls. Now we look at another example from Africa. This one's from Malawi, and it's about tobacco farmers. Now in Malawi, tobacco is one of the main export crops, so leaving aside the ethics of that, it's a serious part of people's incomes, and because tobacco farmers tend to be quite small, the export companies prefer to deal with them on the basis of groups, so they can club together, and it also means that the groups can support each other in other ways. So they're in groups of 15, which they call clubs, and there are 127 such clubs of farmers who are dealing with export companies, and these 127 clubs were randomly allocated, but in this RCT they were randomly allocated into 3 groups. So there are 2 treatment groups. One treatment group gets a savings account, so a savings account is set up in the bank in their name. The other one is offered what's called a commitment savings account, which means that a savings account is set up for the club, for the group, but any money they put in there, they can't take the money out again until it comes around to the next planting season. And then all the groups, including the control group otherwise got nothing, but all 3 groups got advice from people on savings. So they all had information about how to save and what saving might help them with. So what did they find out in this case? Well, again, comparing to control group, when they observed at the start of the next planting season and compared with the earlier observations, again they observed both before and afterwards, they found that the commitment savings treatment group, so the ones that had the savings account that you couldn't take the money out of, they had higher savings levels just before the next planting season. They had cultivated more land, they purchased more inputs for cultivation, so fertilizer, pesticides, improving the soil. They produced harvests with a higher total value in terms of quality and yield were up, and they had higher levels of expenditure. So on things like consumer items, education and so on, they were spending more, so higher levels of expenditure and consumption. On the other hand, the ordinary savings treatment group, that they'd been given the savings treatment, and everything was exactly the same, savings account set up, advice, but their outcomes were indistinguishable from the control group. So it was the commitment savings, the fact they couldn't take the money out, that seems to be associated with all these really positive results. So we can think about what might explain those results. Perhaps you'd like to think about it before the lecture, but that's something I hope we get a chance to talk about in the lecture in terms of what explains this. But the randomized controlled trial part of it is revealing that there seems to be a difference here, and it's the commitment savings treatment that seems to have had some sort of effects on these things, whereas the savings account alone didn't have an effect compared to control. In the next part of the lecture, we'll discuss some criticisms of RCTs.